make this decision for yourself, nobody else. That's, I think, my big, never, always, it's your decision. Make it for yourself.
Mine is simply, it's okay not to be a mum. Whether you chose it or whether it's happened via circumstance, it's okay not to be a mum.
My name is Andrea Thiel. I'm your host, and I'm delighted to speak today to Ruby Warrington and Maria Coffey. Welcome.
Hello.
Hello. So maybe you want to introduce yourselves just quickly to our audience.
Sure.
Ruby, you go.
I'll go first. My name's Ruby Warrington. I'm a British journalist and author, and I've been based in the US since 2012. And I'm here because my most recent book is called Women Without Kids. I've got a copy right here. The Revolutionary Rise of an Unsung Sisterhood. And this came out earlier this year. It is my attempt to valorize the path of non-motherhood, no matter how a person finds themselves here, whether it's by choice or by circumstance. And I use my own personal story and then a lot of journalistic research to kind of unpack all of the conditioning that exists around womanhood and motherhood, which, speaking about the mind fucks of living a child-free life, so much of it comes down to what is expected of us and sort of wading through this minefield of like, what are the external expectations? What are my internal desires? And trying to find our truth within all of that. So in the book, I really unpack all of that external stuff and look at a lot of the internal motivations, a lot of them that might be subconscious around our feelings about becoming mothers. And so, yeah, it's been a really deep, very personal project. And it has really helped me make peace with being a woman without kids on a personal level too.
Beautiful. I can relate to that. Maria has also written a book about being child-free.
Yeah, my name is Maria Coffey. I'm based on the west coast of Canada. I also spend part of the year in Catalonia in northeast Spain. But I do an awful lot of traveling and always have. I call myself in the past a child-free nomad. I'm married and travel with my husband. I'm the author of, this is now my 13th book that I'll be showing you in a minute. I have been writing, my first book was published way back in 1989. It was a memoir about the experience of losing my previous partner, who was a very famous mountaineer who died on Everest. I had never written before, but I just felt compelled to write this memoir after his death. And when I'd met my present husband, I realized I had to unravel the past to move into the future. And then I discovered myself as a writer, and I went on to write many more books, 11 more books, 4 of them for children, actually. Most of them, some of them about our travels, but I also wrote 2 sort of more journalistic books about the emotional impact of high altitude adventure on the people left behind. And then I took a break from writing and came back to it with this book instead, Navigating the Adventures of a Child-Free Life, which is my story of making the decision to choose an adventurous path through life rather than have a family, and the obstacles that I encountered along the way, the wonderful things I encountered along the way, and how it feels now as an older woman. I turned 70 just as the book was going to be published. How it feels, I feel like I'm giving a long view of the child-free life, looking back over, a long life of all the different mindfucks that I went through, and how it feels now. And I unpack the word regret in the book because it's not a word that I like, but that is something, because it's always just everything. As a young woman, it was always like, you're going to regret this when you're older, et cetera, et cetera. So I do unpack that. And I also look at later on in the book what it means to be an old child-free nomad. You know, what's that like? What's it going to be like? You know, what does the future hold? So.
Wow, this is so needed, because exactly the look into the future, right? Because that is like the scariest, where you can't actually even fight it, because what are you going to say? You're going to regret it. Yeah, well, I don't know, right? You don't know. So it's like it's a very unfair thing, and it works. It works on a lot of women. So just quickly, how do you know each other? Did you know each other before, or just because you both wrote books about being child-free?
So I was writing my book, and I was quite far into it when I came across Ruby's book, and it just completely blew me away. I mean, Ruby, I hadn't been following you on social media. I hadn't been following your research, which obviously I should have been doing. It's kind of interesting because I started really writing the book in the early 2020. And since then, there's been this huge growth in the child-free movement. It's incredible. And so I came across Ruby's work and Women Without Kids fairly late in my writing process, and I was completely blown away by it. And I don't think I've ever highlighted a book that much. I read it on my Kindle because I was over in Spain. It was just, and I went through it again last night. I was like, wow, it's like every page I've got a highlighter on. And so I contacted Ruby to ask if she would endorse my book, and to my amazement, she wrote back and said, yes, I'll read it. And she sent me a wonderful, wonderful quote. I just have to say, I was in a podcast with Ruby a while ago, and somebody else in the podcast said this book is a manifesto for the child-free movement, and I really agree with that. It's stunning.
Oh, beautiful.
Thanks. That's so nice to hear. So yes, that's how we know each other. And for my part, yes, I'm 47, contemplating currently menopause. For me, my own looking ahead to menopause as the next sort of life stage that would be coming my way, I suppose, or that I'd be encountering, actually really was one of the things that helped me fully claim and make my peace with my choice not to have children. Because I realized as I looked ahead to the end of my reproductive years that there was zero doubt, zero regret, zero feeling of panic, like I must do this before it's too late. If anything, I felt quite excited about what these different hormonal shifts might bring kind of on the other side. I read a really great book called The Silent Passage by a journalist called Gail Sheehy that reframes menopause as the gateway to a woman's second adulthood. When she is essentially and one of the author's main arguments there is she's freed of the responsibilities of child rearing. And I thought to myself, well, God, I'm so grateful that I was born in a body, in a country, in a culture, in a time when I have had that choice my entire life. Why is this not celebrated, And so, yes, I was also, when Maria reached out, I was really ready to start looking ahead in a more positive way about what it might be like to be a childless elder woman. And so reading her story was very validating and inspiring in terms of, just looking ahead to what options are open to women in our elder years when we haven't dedicated this huge chunk of our adult lives to the very intensive and often very kind of insular labor of child rearing.
Yeah, and it's so important because we often don't have role models, even though there's more now. But when it doesn't exist, you always doubt, where is this actually leading? And there's like one half of your brain knows you're going to be fine, because we also grew up with I grew up in Germany. And so there is like some feminist values, and independent woman values that I grew up with. But the other side of the brain is always still stuck, it seems like, with all the stories that you grew up with. And they sometimes come up, and then you have like both, right? And it's like an accident, in your brain. You're like, is this true or is that true? And then it's like, it can be scary. Yeah. So that's probably like also my next question. Like, why did you feel the urge to write that book? Was that like a moment? Because it's a huge project to do that. Is there like, what was like the moment where you said, I have to actually write a book about this because there's something missing? And what was that?
Well, I'll jump in first because it kind of dovetails from what I was just saying. It was after reading Gail Sheehy's book and having that realization, like, why have I felt so much shame and self-doubt around pursuing a path that, you know, centuries, honestly, of the sort of fight for equal rights for women and gender equality has afforded me. You know, the choice not to become a mother is actually central to the women's liberation movement in all of its forms. Why am I shamed for having lived my life in accordance with this choice that people fought for me to have? Why am I shamed? Why am I made to feel less than? Why am I made to feel like I will not be fulfilled? It just felt like this very deep kind of level of, such an overused word, but gaslighting, you know? And so that for me was the moment when I realized I wanted to write this book. As a journalist, working as a journalist in London in my 20s and 30s, I had been asked by many of my editors to write about my decision or my choice not to have children, because I'd always been quite confident in it. And because I was a journalist, I had a platform to write about it. And I'd always just sort of, my take had always just been, well, it's kind of weird, but I just don't want it. And I hadn't really ever dug deeper below the surface. And I think approaching the end of my reproductive years, and also having, you know, my previous book was called Sober Curious, removing alcohol from my life just created so much more clarity about my inner world, my inner motivations, why I made the choices I had. And so I think I was ready on a personal level to just dive a bit deeper into why I had never wanted to be a mother and why that was the right path for me.
Yeah, no, I think, and it's because I had the same feeling and we're the same age. And so there's something comes around that age, you know, because there's a lot of women, they feel that urge of then having to voice that decision, also kind of like see where this decision maybe come from, and then also fight certain things like shame and the stigma that is attached that you didn't have in your 30s. I didn't feel it in my 30s, but I did feel it all of a sudden in my 40s, and I had no idea where this was coming from. And I was surprised by that. And just like I add one thing, even when I was in Israel now on a research trip, and then there was like I met like a rabbi, and we were sitting in a restaurant, and he was lovely. You know, he was actually from New York. He was there with his wife and his kids and all this. And so we started talking. He's like, so what are you doing here? And I was on a research trip for like about women without kids. I couldn't say it. I'm like, about Israeli culture.
I still have that. I'll be in an Uber, I'll be in a taxi, and the conversation will come up. Oh, I'm an author. What kind of books do you write? And I always talk about my last book. I talk about Sober Curious because I feel like that's more acceptable. And I don't want to, especially honestly, being in a car alone with a strange man, especially, I don't want to bring up anything related to my sexuality, you know, and that is there's an underlying kind of component of this fear of female sexuality, fear of free, sovereign female sexuality that actually is at the root of so much misogyny, so much male sexual entitlement. And that is, again, one of the deeper themes that I touch on in the book. Maria, what was your moment? What was your inception moment for the book?
Well, my moment, it's sort of, I just want to circle back to the menopause, because I kind of just cruised through menopause. I hardly even noticed it. I was lucky, and I was so busy as well. My mother kept saying, it's going to hit you anytime, and it didn't really. And I was just, I didn't have the kind of fear that you were talking about during, or the concerns during menopause. But I did feel very kind of free of the, you know, thinking about the whole child, you know, having a child. However, my life then really ramped up. I mean, we'd already, with my husband, I'd already been traveling the world, going on these really wild expeditions, writing books. But I finished my last book my previous book in 2008, and it had been very research heavy, and I was absolutely exhausted. It had taken me 4 years to write it. And when I was finished, I was completely burnt out. I didn't want to write anymore. And we had started an adventure travel company to feed our addiction for travel. And I just decided to pour all my energies into that. And we also started doing elephant conservation and welfare work. My husband's a veterinarian. And so suddenly we were bouncing around the world more than ever, doing this fascinating work with elephants, developing trips in wild parts of the world. It was a really kind of kaleidoscopic life. And you know, I just kind of cruised through my, you know, 50s and into my 60s. And I had, this is a bit of a long way of telling you how it came around to the book, but in my mid 60s, I suddenly had this moment on a tube in London when I stepped onto this tube and it was almost empty, and a young man stood up to give me his seat. And I thought, well, that's very nice. It wasn't necessary. I could have sat next to him. And I sat in the seat and was just checking my phone as the train pulled out. And then as it pulled out, I looked up and he'd given me the seat for the disabled, pregnant women and the elderly. And it was, I was 66 at the time. And it was just this moment of like, oh,
how did that
people
happen?
are starting to look at me as elderly. And of course, you know, without, I think with my life had been so busy, and also I didn't have growing children to mark the passage of time, and I'd just forgotten, you know. So I started, for the very first time, I started getting a bit freaked about getting older, and what was it going to be like when I was older? You know, what the hell do old child-free nomads do when they get really old and frail? Mm-hmm. So I was kind of mulling this over, and I began to write about that. That's how this book began. I began it seriously in the end of 2019, and I had this metaphor of a riptide, because when I was 21, I was caught in a riptide in Morocco, and I lost consciousness. I was dragged ashore. I was resuscitated on the beach. Wow. And I wanted to use that as a metaphor, because, you know, what I had learned from that experience, I learned a lot of things from that experience, but one thing was that maybe old age is, maybe, you know, the big things in life are like being caught in a riptide. And, you know, as long as you have some skills, you can survive them. Like when I was 21, I didn't know that you were supposed to just let it take you, that eventually it would release you. You might end up somewhere you didn't expect to be, but you'd be all right. And so I wanted to use this as a metaphor of going into the very scary territory of old age, is how I felt. Mm-hmm. But so I started to write about this, looking at past experiences in my life and what I could learn from them to help me with this new big adventure. And I realized with every single chapter, I was writing about my decision not to have children. Mm-hmm. And I realized that was kind of the key to everything, you know, the key to everything in my life. That was really the big story. And that's really what I needed to explore. And the story about heading into old age would just be a part of that. So yeah, so that was kind of one of my aha moments, was suddenly I just looked at, you know, one of those mornings when you look back at what you've written and it's like, well, this is actually a story about being child-free. Mm-hmm. And what that was like, you know, growing up in the 60s and 70s and, you know, 50s, 60s, 70s, and what it's like now as an older woman. So
why do you think, I feel like there is like many women are speaking up about this right now. There is like kind of like an awakening of this. Why do you think that is? And what do you consider also the biggest mindfuck around being child-free? And if there is a relationship between those two things?
I think Ruby's better to answer this, but I just want to tell you two stories just to kind of lead into that. When I first started writing, when I decided that I was going to write about being child-free, and that was at the beginning of 2020, my agent, who is no longer my agent, said to me, no, she's in New York. No, it's been done. Nobody's interested in that. Mm-hmm. I talked to another agent, that was she was a she. I talked to a male agent also in New York, who said, you know, don't do this. The demographic gap between you and the women who are making the decision now is just way too big. Nobody's going to be interested. Yes, Ruby, which was like a kick in the stomach. It was just awful. So you know, it stopped me in my tracks for a few months until I thought, fuck them, I'm just going to write this book, you know. And it was so interesting as I was writing the book, like more and more and more was happening. And so, Ruby, over to you. Why do you think now? What's
Well, I mean, so when I had this idea to write a book on this subject, which did come from quite a personal place, as soon as I put my journalistic hat on, which came quite quickly afterwards, because that's what my career has been really to date, I zoomed out and was able to see that, in fact, in every single country around the world, the birth rate is dropping very steeply. And with each new generation that comes through, women have fewer children. And this is in direct correlation to women having more access to education and ultimately a chance at financial freedom. So women's empowerment, if we think of empowerment as women's ability to be able to be self-sufficient and to not be reliant on, you know, a potentially abusive or controlling partner for their material safety and stability, which is not the case, obviously, for millions of women still in the world, but it is becoming more common. I thought, well, there's a huge untold story, untold sort of feminist story woven into this drop-off in the birth rate. And I think that, so what I'm trying to say is, I think since the advent of the really more mainstream, and mainstream largely because, you know, it was broadcast on television, and, you know, we've had global travel since the late 1960s, early 1970s, we've had women talking about these issues, and therefore giving each other permission to have fewer children or no children at all. And then I think, I think the birth rate has been dropping steeply since the middle of the last century. And now we have layered on top of that the advent of social media, and everybody with a smartphone having the access to a platform to be able to talk about their choice, talk about the reasons for their choice, and to further validate that choice for people. And so I think there's all of these different factors that mean it could feel like there's this explosion of the child-free movement, but it's been bubbling for a very long time, actually, as a result largely of the women's liberation movement and women having more equality in terms of not least economic life and business life, et cetera, and even political life in some places. But so yeah, I think that's what we're seeing. I don't think it's new. I think we're just it's more visible now, largely because of social media. And I think it's very interesting. So we started our projects at almost exactly the same time, Maria. I had the idea in December 2019. I wrote the proposal in 2020 and pitched it in the autumn of 2020, when I had a barrage of no's. No one wanted the book. And I was told, people don't buy these books on this subject. There's no interest in this subject, which was not what my research was showing me, you know? And I was like, how can people not be interested in a subject that is at the absolute heart of the future thriving of humanity? I mean, are you kidding me? Let alone like literally central to every single woman's life. This question, shall I be a mother? How many children should I have? With whom? At what point in my life? This is central to how every woman's life will play out. How can no one be interested in this subject? So luckily, one publisher was interested, and I'm so grateful that they decided to pick it up. I was prepared to self-publish it if I needed to, though, because I just felt it was such an important conversation to be had with the depth and nuance that it really deserves. Because for me as well, yes, there have been lots of other books on childlessness, child freedom. None of them really dug as deep as I needed to go. None of them really joined the dots in the way that I wanted them joined or was called to investigate. And often I found as well that women without kids were often divided into these two camps. You're either sad and lonely, or sad and we need to give you sympathy because you weren't able to have the children that you wanted, or you're defiantly, selfishly child-free, just like saying fuck it to everything and living your own life. And I knew as well from my own experience and the experience of other women in my life that it wasn't that binary. This is very complex. There's a lot of complex emotions on both sides of the fence, not that there is a fence, but so I just felt that was really limiting as well in terms of women identifying or finding their place as women without kids. You know, I'm either this or that, and if I don't fit into either camp 100%, then where does that leave me? So in the first chapter of the book is called The Motherhood Spectrum, and it talks about this idea that any one individual of any gender actually will have, you know, their feelings, their desire, their aptitude for parenthood impacted by multiple different factors throughout the course of their life, and their feelings about it might change throughout the course of their life. And that's actually normal, you know, when what's upheld as normal is this, you know, very biological urge to procreate, which my research also showed me does not exist.
That's, I think, what I found so exciting about your book, because I'd been trying to bring across, mine's a completely personal story, and I'd been trying to bring across how complex it had been and how nuanced, you know, that I find there's so much, you know, in the growth of the movement on social media, there's a lot of it is very divisive, which really worries me, you know, and I just wanted to, exactly what you said, I just wanted to show all these complex emotions, and the deep nuances of this, you know, the societal pressures, you know, the personal doubts, etc. And so yeah, I think you brought that across really beautifully.
Have you? I sometimes find, because I'm also like, because I'm doing a documentary, and whenever I brought it up, even also to publishers or editors, that also sometimes from women, that there's a very stoic attitude, also women that don't have kids, that completely did not want to talk about this or did not see at all why it needs to be a film about this, and almost dismissed it, but in a way where it's like, what are you talking? What's the problem? There's no story here. And and where is that? Because that for me was also, I'm like, interesting, because that is like a double, you know, where I was trying to figure out, where is this even coming from, the denial of that? And can you, maybe Ruby has figured that out? Is there something, what is exactly, what is the biggest mindfuck? What do you think is the biggest mindfuck around being child-free?
Maria, do you want to go first?
Yeah, Ruby. Or Maria.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. For me, it's really quite a practical one. You know, I was raised by a single parent. My dad was in the picture, but he didn't live with us. And my mum worked incredibly hard, both outside of the home and inside the home, and still never had enough money. And money worries were a constant source of anxiety for her and for me, because she relied on me as the grown-up, the older kid, to kind of be the buffer of a lot. I soaked up a lot of the financial worry. I was very keen to start earning my own money as soon as I could, age 12. I started, you know, doing odd jobs and Saturday jobs and making sure that I always had my own money, which my mum would often borrow from me when she was short for groceries, that kind of thing, which is by no means a tale of woe. I was well provided for in most areas of my life. And there are many kids, obviously, who are living well below the poverty line and didn't have nearly the financial, you know, stability that I did. That said, I think this idea that a woman is just expected to give up the lion's share of her time, energy, and resource to raising other children without having a serious conversation about the impact that is going to have on her earning capacity, which is borne out statistically across the board, just makes me so angry. We live in a world where, let's face it, nothing is getting cheaper. It's harder and harder for the majority of people to make ends meet, and to then layer on the shame of not wanting to bring in another human who's going to be entirely dependent on you at a material level until they're old enough to, you know, earn their own keep. I find it sickening, especially in a country like the United States, where there is zero movement on anything like paid parental leave, free healthcare, subsidized childcare. It's just, it's absolutely maddening. And it comes back to this very old, very patriarchal idea that child rearing is a labor of love that women are biologically wired to want to perform and to be able to perform without question. So that for me is the biggest head fuck. It's really practical, but it's just maddening.
So for me, there are a few mind fucks. The first one was my mother, who I grew up in an Irish Catholic family. And my mother was very good with guilt. She was a fantastic woman. She was a real matriarch. But from the time I was 7, she started saving for my big white wedding and telling me about the children I was going to have, that I'd live close by and have a nice husband, and the kids would be running in and out the house. So I grew up with this massive pressure from her. And also, of course, I went to a convent school where I was told that it was, God's will for men and women to marry and have children and all of that. So that was growing up, all of those religious pressures and maternal pressures. And I knew from an early age, I didn't want that. I wanted an adventurous life, even when I was a kid. And then another one for me was a fear of loss, because I lost my first partner before my husband now when I was 30, when he died in a mountaineering accident. And that left me with this awareness of how terrible it was to lose somebody that you loved. And I thought, well, if I had a kid, what would that be like? I didn't want to put myself through that. I then fell in love with somebody who wanted an adventurous life, but did want children. And we managed to navigate that and set off around the world. And all the years that I was traveling, when we were going on long kayaking and bicycling expeditions in really remote places, I was always asked everywhere, how many children do you have? And by the women and men that we met. And these were communities and cultures where the child-free choice was unfathomable. People had children. This is like, kayaking down the river Ganges and kayaking the length of Lake Malawi, being in very remote cultures where people were very poor, and for them, children were an insurance for the future. And so constantly I was asked about my children at home, and because I'm a recovering Catholic, I found it really hard to lie. So I would just have to face their horror at the fact that I didn't have children. But the biggest mind fuck for me in those communities was that the women felt sorry for me. I was there thinking in these very remote villages, thinking these poor women, they can't stop having babies. They can't stop the babies dying. The birth rate is so high. For example, in Malawi, the kids were dying of malaria all the time, and then AIDS was on the rise. So they can't stop having babies. They can't stop the babies dying. They'll never get out of this village. They're trapped by poverty. And then they would turn around, find out that I didn't have children, presume that I was barren, that was always the word, and just shower me with pity and sympathy. And that was as I was approaching, that was when I was in my approaching 40. And that was a really big mind fuck. Like, I really had to sort of get my head around this to think, what am I doing the right thing? Am I abnormal? When you're sort of so far out of your own world. So yeah, I think those were, those were the biggest ones for me. But also my peers, women and men who were in the adventure community, doing, climbing around the world, going off on long expeditions, suddenly started settling down, having children. And I got this more from the men than the women. I mean, I have a number of male friends, some of them who'd been ex-boyfriends, that actually said to me, having a child will complete you. And I think that was one thing that was a huge mindfuck. And it made me very angry, that they would presume that. But yeah, so those were the big ones.
Wow, huge.
They were huge. They were a lot
No.
to deal with, actually. And
Yeah,
but at the heart of it, deep down, I always knew I was on the right path. And I think I was strong enough, to sort of consider these things and be affected by them. And the hardest one was my mother, to be honest. And when she was dying, and I was in my 50s by then, I finally spent a lot of time, because I'd gone to the other side of the world. I'd broken her heart in so many ways. So I spent 8 months with her at the end of her life. And a week before she died, she asked me if I regretted not having children. And she'd never actually asked me that before. And it was a really difficult moment, because of course I wanted, I did say, no, I'm really happy with my life. But what I didn't say to her was that what I regretted was not been able to give her what I knew would have really made her happy. Because I was the only daughter, and a grandchild from me, I knew would have kind of completed her in some way, and I just couldn't give that to her. And that was a tough one. But yeah.
Wow.
I can imagine that.
Mm-hmm.
That is great, because I think when you don't want to have kids, it also takes strength at a certain, like for me, it also took strength to actually go forward and through with that, because it wasn't always easy. there is a lot of things that kind of like come, like all these things that you guys just described, that come at you and you start like doubting yourself, or you feel weird about it, or even bad about yourself for not wanting that, and then to actually go like pursue with that, and not be like, okay, maybe I should have a kid. But that is like, for me, this is like exactly these mind fucks. And I think this is kind of like relates also to how women give away their power. Because if we would see that it's actually in our power, whether it's our choice, it's a gift from us to give to this world, right? And when I then also, it makes me also angry when I see mothers complaining that they're not getting support from whatever, because and they have to work and they don't know how to take care of their children. I'm asking, like, you know, there's like, it's completely the other way around. We should be able to demand that if we knew it was in our power. But I think women don't realize how much power we have.
Right. And I think, Maria, what for me just kind of was the undercurrent of all the examples you gave was just this underlying idea that women's sole, true, valid, only valid role in society is to provide the labor, the child rearing, the birthing of the future generations. It comes up in, you know, this idea of, well, this is what a woman is here to do. This is what's expected of us within our religious context, and it's what family means. It comes up, you know, among the women in Malawi who don't have the options to have any other role in society. And so their conditioning by that is like, well, if you don't have that, then who even are you, you know? And I think what you said about like children in poorer nations being an investment, you know, this is literally, this is our material security, you know, because we don't have the option to generate that for ourselves in other ways, especially as women. And then in the last one as well, the idea that you won't actually be a complete whole human being until you go through this experience. It's all conditioning. It's all conditioning, but it's so deep throughout societies across the globe. And the way that we undo it, I suppose, is having conversations like this. It's questioning, shining a light on that's where this is coming from, you know, and what happens when we question that conditioning.
Right.
Yeah. And that's why I'm so grateful for you writing these books, and for many others that are really fighting for these, you know, that to be seen, you know, in the child-free scene. And I saw, like, I have to ask you, of course, because I think you were with Chelsea Handler. She invited you in your book, right? So just like,
yes, indeed.
Yeah. How was that?
It was great. I mean, it was really great to have that platform to talk about this, you know, and to be able to communicate with her about it. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. It wasn't necessarily my favorite conversation about the book. She's a comedian, you know, and so it wasn't really the kind of like in-depth conversation that I want to have, like the one we're having here, you know, and on other podcasts I've done. But it certainly felt, I know it brought a lot more eyes to the conversation. I've had a lot of outreach since that, with people wanting to know about events, retreats. One thing I've discovered, and Maria, I'm sure you'll experience this too, is that anywhere I have spoken, especially in person, about the book, whether it's been a bookstore event or a talk, or I hosted a retreat, like an in-person weekend-long retreat in the summer as well, I have just felt this beyond desire, but hunger, raging hunger among women without kids, to have places to find each other, to connect, to have community. Because I think that for so many of us, we can feel like we're the only one. And so much of the mind fucks, they're mind fucks because they're all happening in our minds. We don't have any outlet for them. We don't have anyone to mirror back to us. Hey, this is what's going on because I'm experiencing it too. Or yeah, I've asked those questions also, or I've got those pushback or whatever. Like, that's the stuff that makes us know that we're okay, like that helps us unravel it all. And I see a huge desire among this community for actual real places to meet each other and create together and dream together and get ingenious about what our futures as childless elder women might look like. Humans are humans are brilliant at coming up with solutions and figuring stuff out. It's how we got to the top of the food chain. It's how we got where we are today, right? It's how we come to dominate on this planet. And so back to, you know, the beginning of this conversation, and Maria, what you were talking about, like, what will our childless elder years look like? I have full faith that we'll figure it out, because we'll have to, you know, we'll figure it out. That's what humans do. We just haven't had a need to before. We just haven't had a need to until now.
I'm still figuring it out. I mean, a few years ago, we tried, we had a little experiment with something called community co-housing. And it was a very fast and furious experiment, because we just fled. It was awful. It's just not, you know, that kind of created community just didn't work for us, you know, the intentional community.
What was the setup? What was the setup?
So the setup, it's 30 houses, 60 homes on a 10-acre property. And this is kind of a model that was developed in Scandinavia, I think. And the homes are divided into 3 clusters or pods around sort of a circular area. And the idea is people own their own homes, but there's a communal house where there are some meals during the week and events, you know, big kind of communal meeting place. There's communal workshop, communal gardens. It all sounded quite lovely. And it was supposed to be multi-generational. And to be honest, that actually attracted me, you know, because I do like kids, you know, I like being around kids. So I kind of like the idea of being, you know, an elder in this sort of multi-generational community. We'd actually been invited to move into one by 2 young friends who have a small child. She was small back then, and they were just developing it. But it was too early for us, and it was too far away from an airport, far away from the coast. We were traveling a lot. So shortly after that, a place came up near to, you know, where we're based here in Canada. And my husband said, let's just try it out as an experiment, because it felt way too early. And I couldn't go to see it. I was actually on a fundraising trek for elephants in Kenya when all this came up, and he went to see it, and I had to make a decision in Nairobi airport as to whether or not we should, you know, go for this, and we did, and we moved in, and it was just all wrong. It was the wrong people. They were people who didn't want us to travel. They wanted us to be there all the time. There was a lot of kind of routine meetings, and I think one of the reasons I never wanted kids as well is I have a horror of routine, you know.
Me too.
Me too. Yeah, oh my god, this is like death to me. I'm like, oh my god, oh my god.
Yeah, it's why I gave up a teaching career. I started teaching, but the horror of knowing every September what every week was going to be like, and then bells going throughout the day, and for me, having a child would be like that, you know, on steroids. I just couldn't face it. So anyway, we moved into this place, and it just didn't work for us. And we broke the record of the shortest stay ever. You know, we got out of there, and we managed to get out without losing a lot of money or anything. We got out. And so I'm still figuring it out, but I really have faith. I have faith that something will work out, you know, and I kind of realized as well in late 2020, when I was still working on the book, you know, we have a little house. Actually, we left this place and we went traveling again, and we ended up in northern Spain, in Catalonia, and came across this tiny little village which we fell in love with, and found a tiny little house which we could afford, and bought it. And that's our base in Europe, and and that feels like kind of a real kind of healthy community. And we were there, we went into lockdown there during the pandemic, and ended up staying for almost a year. And during that time, my husband had a really bad bike accident. And it was during that, it was so stressful, as you can imagine, in global pandemic, in a foreign country, a language that, you know, I don't speak any Catalan, speak a bit of Spanish, but, you know, it was really stressful. And it was during that time, you know, up to this point, I had started, one of my big fears about getting older was, we've been traveling the world. We've never created a settled community. We parachute back into our place in Canada, have big parties, meet up with friends, and then we go off sailing or something. And, you know, we're always on the move. We've never I've never never, I've always sort of envied my friends who have book clubs and go to yoga classes together, because I've never developed that kind of sort of settled community. I have people all over the world. But I realized when my husband had his accident that I do have a community, and it's like a web across the world. Everywhere where we've touched down and spent some time, we've connected with people who really mean a lot to us, and we mean a lot to them. And that kind of suddenly came to the fore when we had this crisis, and it's given me a lot of faith that, like Ruby said, something will work out. When we get really old and really frail, it'll be okay, because we've developed love out there. We've got people who love us. I write in the book the importance of recognizing and valuing the people that you can call on in the middle of the night. The people who you can reach out to when something terrible happens, and they're there for you. And it'll be okay. And it's like the riptide. It'll be. I'll end up somewhere I didn't expect to be, but it's going to be okay.
Yeah, it's making me think. I just want to reflect one thing. I don't know if when you were in Israel, you were meeting with Orna Donut. Are you familiar with her work?
Yeah,
she's incredible.
Incredible.
She wrote Regretting Motherhood, which is such a revolutionary text. And I interviewed her for Women Without Kids, and she told me that her new research project is around older women without kids, and whether whether that idea of regretting non-motherhood exists among older women without kids. Her research had found that nobody regretted it. If it had been a conscious choice for them and they knew that was their path, there were no regrets. And I was asking her, had these women found ways to, combine their resources and find ways to live and together and support them? And she said, no, not many of them. Most of them wanted to live alone. And this was part of their part of their personality, of really a strong sense of autonomy. I need my own space. I need to be on my own schedule and to make my own decisions, was part of the reason they had not wanted children, which I think all of us kind of can relate to a little bit. But I found that very interesting. I can't wait for her new book to read more on this. But I can relate to that too. I am a loner by nature. I'm not a joiner. I'm not a groups person, and I never have been. For me, having children is like one never-ending group activity, and the thought of that just is exhausting.
Yeah.
And so I can recognize in myself, well, yes, I don't think that a group living situation is going to work for me when I'm 90. I mean, if I make it that far, so we'll need to find other ways to work it out. I mean, Japan has one of the most rapidly aging societies. They have one of the lowest birth rates. And I've been reading articles about how, they're utilizing AI and robots to help care for the aging populations. And some people are horrified by this. And I'm quite excited about the prospect of how these technologies might develop over the next 20, 30 years, and what kinds of technological advances we'll be able to, lean on to support. The thing is, there are going to be lots of us. There's going to be lots of kinless elders. It's actually one of the fastest growing demographics in the United States. And so we, on a collective level, will need to find solutions for our care when the time comes. So
there is a little bit, exactly, because there is human connection that you crave when you don't have it at all. And I'm also not a group person and doing everything together all the time. I can't. And and it was funny because I went to Israel with the search because I had golden girls in mind, right? And I'm like, they're probably the elder women there because they like to live together. There's it's a whole thing in Israel, right? Kibbutz style.
The kibbutz community, yes.
And I'm like, for sure, there must be some older women that didn't have kids. They find each other and live like this. No. And that exactly. And I also asked her this. She's like, no.
The village that we spending a good part of the year in Catalonia, to me, it's almost like a perfect solution. I mean, obviously, I'm an outsider. I'm not there all the time, which is kind of the key. I'm always dropping in and out of places. But everybody meets in the village square. They don't tend to meet in each other's homes. And, you wander through the village square, somebody's sitting at the table, the next thing somebody else comes, and then there's a big table, and it's always multi-generational. It's not an ageist place, so one of my best friends there is in her late 80s, and she's always hanging out with younger people in the village. You know, she's always there having coffee with them. And there's this lovely sort of sense of, you know, that there are big events, you know, big outdoor events, parties, and everybody brings food, sits under the trees. And again, it's this multi-generational thing where you're not, you know, and you know, there are a number of women there who are single or widowed and who don't have kids. There's some gay couples there, similarly don't have kids. And, you know, there's this lovely sense of community, which isn't sort of forced, which isn't scheduled, you know, which isn't created. It just sort of free flowing, you know, it's just natural. And I kind of think, I don't think you can, I think it's hard to actually create that. Maybe you
manufacture a village.
And I know that when we were traveling a lot, we would always love being in the villages, but at the same time be aware of how claustrophobic it would be to live in a village, you know. But and so I don't know how I do living full time in my Catalonian village, but it's obviously a much kind of freer place than places I was traveling back then. But I actually don't think there's any one answer. I think you know, you have to figure it out. But I think the sense of, as I think, you know, as you both refer to, in the future there's going to be so much technological advances that we can connect with each other in different ways as well, which gives me a lot of hope, you know.
Me too. Thank you both. This was amazing to have you. Just like first of all, like, is there something that you are, how can we find you? Is it something that you are offering? Because I think I really love your title, also the Unsung Sisterhood. Ruby, is it like, are you organizing something around that? Maria, are you organizing? Are you like, is there some workshops or something coming up where people can find you?
I'm not at this point. No, I'm just, my book is just coming out, so I haven't sort of got to that stage yet. Ruby,
I was going to say, we both have books that people can read.
Yes, that's the important thing. Read the book.
Complementary books, I think.
Yes.
And I recorded all of the research interviews I did for Women Without Kids. I recorded as a podcast too. So there is a Women Without Kids podcast, which is a limited series where people can listen to those conversations. And I do have, in March 2024, I'll be hosting another weekend-long in-person retreat at a center called Kripalu, which is in Massachusetts on the East Coast, about a couple of hours outside of upstate of New York. So yeah, that is the next in-person thing that I have on the calendar. And like I said, based on the hunger that I felt in rooms full of women without kids for those kinds of experiences, I will plan more. As I have also mentioned, not really a groups person. Although it's funny, if I'm leading the group,
then maybe. I
mean, maybe I was some kind of a cult leader in another life, but if I'm leading the group, it's okay. I can handle it. But yeah, I always actually do get a huge amount of enrichment from being in those spaces. I've done retreats with my Sober Curious project as well. So yeah, and it's so gratifying to see how much other people get out of it and the connections that are made. And so yeah, that's coming up too. I'll announce it on my Instagram at Ruby Warrington and on my website, which is just rubywarrington.com.
Well, maybe Ruby, we should have a down the road. We should have a joint workshop in my Catalonian village, where there is an amazing place that we could have it.
Please.
And let's do that. I mean, I'm
in touch.
Yeah, because I've done creative workshops I've led a lot of adventure travel trips, but I've done a lot of creative workshops in the past around writing. And
I was just going to say we could do a writing retreat.
Yeah,
that
okay.
would be amazing.
Yeah, that would be amazing. That's great.
You're invited.
See,
yes.
A new idea is born for building a community, right?
See, exactly.
Finding each other. Just one last question, and then I'll let you go. Like, imagine like there is like a catastrophe and all your work is destroyed, and I just hand you a piece of paper, and you can only write like one thing on this piece of paper, something that matters to you as a child-free woman that you want to leave behind, and you're now leaving in planet Earth because you gotta go.
Do Don't make this decision for yourself, nobody else. That's, I think, my big, never, always, it's your decision. Make it for yourself.
Mine is simply, it's okay not to be a mum. Whether you chose it or whether it's happened via circumstance, it's okay not to be a mum.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. Thank you both a lot.
Okay, thank you so much.
This was great.
Great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.